The desert had a way of keeping secrets. Ruth Alvarez had learned that long ago, back when she and her late husband drove west with everything they owned packed into the back of a borrowed pickup truck. Mile marker 12 wasn't much to look at, just a stretch of cracked asphalt outside Tucson, where the highway bent slightly south and the land flattened into endless sand and scrub. That was where they stopped. That was where they stayed. The adobe house had been built in the 1950s by a man who believed walls should be thick enough to keep the heat out and the noise of the world even farther away. Its pale brown exterior blended into the desert like it belonged there. The roof was flat, the windows narrow, the porch shaded by an old mesquite tree whose roots twisted deep into the earth. Ruth was 76 now, widowed for nearly a decade, and still living alone in that same house. People said she was stubborn. Ruth preferred the word steady. Every morning at exactly 5:45, she woke before the sun. She brewed coffee, strong and black, and carried it to the small kitchen table facing east. From there, she watched the sky change colors as the desert came alive. Purple, orange, gold. She listened. The wind, the distant hum of traffic, the soft ticking of the wall clock. She liked knowing what silence sounded like. The house was clean, organized, and unchanged. The same furniture, the same framed photos, the same filing cabinet tucked into the corner of the spare room, metal, dented, and locked. Inside that cabinet lived Ruth's real treasures: documents, records, memories written in ink. She had spent 38 years as a court stenographer for Pima County. She typed faster than most people could speak and remembered details others forgot. She had learned, early in her career, that the truth always mattered, but proof mattered more. That habit never left her, which was why, when her grandson showed up one afternoon in early April, Ruth noticed everything. When Mateo arrived, the sound of the engine came first. Ruth looked up from her crossword puzzle as dust rose beyond the mesquite tree. A dark blue SUV rolled into the dirt driveway, its tires crunching over gravel that hadn't heard traffic in weeks. She watched as the driver's door opened. Mateo stepped out. He looked thinner than she remembered. His hair was longer, pulled back into a loose knot. His shoulders sagged like a man carrying invisible weight. Ruth stood slowly and walked to the front door. She opened it before he knocked. "Abuela," Mateo said, his voice catching just a little. "Hey." She studied his face. The familiar eyes, the shadow of stubble, the nervous smile that never quite reached his eyes. "You look tired," she said. Mateo exhaled. "Yeah, I am." She stepped aside. "Come in. The desert doesn't wait for anyone." Inside, Mateo dropped his duffel bag near the door. He looked around like he was afraid something had changed. Nothing had. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one Mateo used to color at as a child. Ruth poured coffee. He drank it with too much sugar. He talked fast. Lost job, bad breakup, apartment gone, nowhere else to go. "I just need a little time," he said, staring into his mug. "I won't be any trouble. I'll help out, fix things, whatever you need." Ruth nodded. "You can use the back room. It's cooler in the afternoons." Relief washed over his face. "Thank you," he said. "I swear I won't take advantage." She smiled, but inside a small voice whispered, "People never mean to." The helpful phase. For the first few weeks, Mateo was exactly as promised. He fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom, replaced a broken fence post, cleaned the dust off the solar panels. He cooked dinner twice a week and drove Ruth into town for groceries without being asked. Neighbors waved again. The house felt less quiet. Mateo talked about finding work, about getting his life together, about how lucky he was to have family. Ruth listened. She always listened. At night, she typed. Her old stenography machine sat on the desk like an artifact from another time. She used it not because she had to, but because it reminded her who she was. She recorded notes, Dates, conversations, observations. Not because she distrusted Mateo, because habits die hard. Small shifts. The first thing Ruth noticed was the mail. Mateo started bringing it in, even when she was home. He stacked it neatly on the counter, sometimes already opened. "Just trying to help," he said with a grin. Then came the phone calls. His voice grew louder, his tone sharper. "She's fine," Ruth heard him say one afternoon. "Yeah, I'm staying with her. Someone's got to look out for her." Look out for her. The word stayed with her. Mateo started parking his SUV under the carport. The silence after the dust. The desert always takes its silence back. Even after Mateo drove away, Ruth Alvarez waited for it. The sound of tires crunching over gravel faded, but the echo lingered in her ears, as if memories refused to leave quietly. She closed the door, turned the lock, checked it twice. Habit. In the kitchen, she brewed coffee the way she always did. Not too strong, not too weak. She wrapped both hands around the mug and sat at the table facing east. The sun was already climbing. Everything looked normal. And yet, nothing felt settled. That night, Ruth woke from a dream she couldn't shake. Someone was pulling open her filing cabinet, metals scraping, papers whispering. She sat upright in the dark, heart steady but alert. She knew then what she had suspected all along. This wasn't over. The first letter. 3 days later, the letter arrived. Official envelope, law firm letterhead, Tucson, Arizona. Ruth opened it carefully. Notice of intent to contest occupancy. Mateo was challenging the eviction, claiming he had been her primary caregiver, claiming she was suffering from cognitive decline. Ruth folded the letter and placed it on the table. Her hands didn't shake. She simply exhaled. She had seen this before, decades ago, sitting quietly in courtrooms while families turned love into leverage. She opened a different drawer that evening and removed a folder labeled Contingency. The lawyer who remembered her. The next morning, Ruth drove into Tucson. She chose a small law office far from downtown, the kind with cracked sidewalks and crowded shelves, the kind where real work got done. The receptionist looked up and smiled. "Mrs. Alvarez?" Inside the office, a man stood when he saw her, graying hair, familiar eyes. "Ruth," she replied. "Daniel." Daniel Weiss, former assistant district attorney. Years earlier, he had spoken in courtrooms where Ruth recorded every word. "You haven't changed," she replied. "Neither have you." She laid the documents out on his desk. Daniel listened without interrupting. Finally, he nodded. "He underestimated you." "They always do," Ruth said. "And he's very wrong," Daniel replied. Mateo's second move. Mateo didn't stop with the legal challenge. He spoke to neighbors, filed anonymous reports, and one morning, Ruth found a small notice in the local paper. Concern raised regarding elderly woman living outside city limits. Ruth folded the newspaper. "They don't understand the desert," she said softly. The visit. A social worker arrived in late July, young, polite, clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Alvarez, we're just here to make sure you're safe." Ruth opened the door wide. "Would you like some tea?" They sat at the kitchen table. Ruth calmly presented medical records, bank statements, and property documents. Then she placed a small tape recorder on the table. "What's that?" the woman asked. "Evidence," Ruth replied. Mateo's voice filled the room. "It's basically my house already." The social worker's expression changed. There were no more visits after that. Patience, desert style. Mateo's attorney proposed a settlement. He said, "Sell the house, split the value." Ruth declined. "This isn't just property," she told Daniel. "It's my history." The case went to court. Ruth was ready. The courtroom. The courtroom was cold, the opposite of the desert. Mateo wore a tailored suit, confidence stitched into every movement. Ruth sat quietly in a cardigan and pressed blouse. The judge looked at her. "Mrs. Alvarez, do you understand why we're here today?" "Yes," Ruth said evenly. "Because some people believe age weakens judgment." The judge raised an eyebrow. Mateo's attorney argued caregiving responsibility, mental decline, concern. Daniel stood. "Your Honor, may I play Exhibit C?" The recording echoed through the courtroom. Mateo's own words filled the silence. The judge struck the gavel. The ruling. Case dismissed. Restraining order granted. False reporting flagged for investigation. Mateo stared at the floor. Ruth looked at him once. No anger, no triumph, only certainty. Home at mile marker 12. Back at the house, Ruth unlocked the door and stepped inside. The desert wind greeted her like an old friend. She locked the filing cabinet, placed the key back where it belonged. She poured coffee and sat at the table. The sun sunk low over the sand. The desert kept its silence. The truth remained. Final line. In the desert, only those who protect both memory and proof survive, and Ruth Alvarez had mastered both. What comes after victory? Winning a case doesn't end a war. Ruth Alvarez knew that. The desert taught her long ago that survival isn't about the moment you drive danger away, it's about what you do when the land grows quiet again. For the first few weeks after the ruling, life at mile marker 12 returned to its familiar rhythm. Morning coffee, the slow crawl of sunlight across the kitchen floor, wind moving through the mesquite tree like breath through lungs. But Ruth listened differently now. She listened for intrusion. She listened for echoes. Because people like Mateo didn't disappear. They retreated. They waited. They learned. And Ruth had learned to expect that. The anonymous call. It came on a Monday afternoon. Ruth was in the backyard trimming dry branches when her phone rang. Blocked number. She let it ring. Then voicemail. That night, she listened. A man's voice, low, distorted, careful. "You can't keep it forever. Someone will make sure of that." No name, no threat that could be proven, just intention. Ruth deleted the message, but not before writing down the exact time, duration, and tone. Old habits. The second filing cabinet. That same evening, Ruth unlocked a cabinet she hadn't opened in years. Not the metal one, the wooden one built into the wall behind the spare room closet, hidden, forgotten. Inside were older records, her husband's military documents, land surveys from the 1950s, correspondence with the Bureau of Land Management, and one envelope, thick and yellowed, marked in her husband's handwriting, "If anyone comes for the land." Ruth sat down. She opened it. The thing Mateo never knew. The property at mile marker 12 wasn't just a house. It was a buffer, a protected strip of land adjacent to a long-abandoned government access route, one that had never officially been decommissioned. Decades earlier, Ruth and her husband had been approached quietly, offered compensation, asked to keep records. They had agreed, and in return, the property had been placed under a special historical use designation, one that made ownership transfer nearly impossible without federal review. Mateo never knew, because Mateo never asked the right questions. The realtor. In August, a woman showed up at the gate. Mid-30s, sunglasses, confident smile. "I'm Rebecca," she said. "I represent an interested buyer." Ruth didn't open the gate. "This property is not for sale." Rebecca smiled anyway. People say that until the right number appears. Ruth leaned on the fence. You should tell your client to stop wasting money. Rebecca hesitated. May I ask who the client is? You may, Ruth said. You won't get an answer. That night, Ruth made another call. Mateo's mistake. Mateo's biggest flaw wasn't greed, it was impatience. He started talking to the wrong people, to friends, to investors, to a man who claimed he could make land problems disappear. Daniel heard about it first. He's trying to force a distress narrative, claim abandonment, unsafe living conditions. Daniel nodded. Good, she said. Daniel paused. Good? Yes, Ruth replied. Let him. The inspection. 2 inspectors arrived the following week. County officials, clipboards, polite suspicion. Ruth welcomed them in. She showed them everything. Maintenance records, structural reports, solar compliance certificates, and then, casually, she handed them a federal designation notice. The color drained from one inspector's face. This land? He began. Yes, Ruth said. That land. They left within 20 minutes. The report was sealed. Mateo pushes too hard. 3 days later, Mateo filed another motion, emergency guardianship. This time the judge wasn't amused. False reporting stacked up. Harassment documented. The voicemail was submitted. Mateo was warned. One more filing, the judge said, and sanctions would follow. Mateo laughed afterwards, too loudly in the hallway. Ruth watched from the bench. She didn't smile. She memorized. The desert storm. The storm came without warning. Wind howled across the land, tearing at old signs, lifting sand into the air like smoke. Ruth secured the house and waited. Power flickered, then died. In the darkness, she sat calmly. Because storms passed. People didn't always. That night, headlights appeared at the edge of the property. Ruth watched through the window. A truck. Engine running. Not approaching. Waiting. She called the sheriff. The truck left before deputies arrived. Mateo denied involvement. Of course he did. The will. The next morning, Ruth made a decision she had delayed for years. She updated her will. Not to punish, to clarify. The house would not pass to family. It would. After the silence settles. The desert did not celebrate victories. It absorbed them. Weeks passed after Mateo's final visit. No letters arrived. No unfamiliar cars slowed near the gate. The land returned to its oldest habit, endurance. Ruth Alvarez welcomed the routine, but she did not relax. She had learned something important over the years. When conflict disappears too cleanly, it is rarely gone. It has only changed shape. Every morning she walked the perimeter of the property. She checked fence posts, examined tire marks in the dirt, and noted anything unfamiliar, not because she was afraid, but because she believed in awareness. Inside the house, she resumed her quiet rituals. Coffee at sunrise, radio news at noon, typed notes before bed. She no longer wrote about Mateo. She wrote about patterns. The letter that wasn't from Mateo. The envelope arrived in October. No return address, thick paper, handwritten. Ruth opened it slowly. Mrs. Alvarez, we are contacting you regarding a matter connected to a federal land use review conducted in the late 1970s. Your property has surfaced again in a modern audit. We are requesting a voluntary meeting. Ruth read it twice. Then a third time. She folded the letter and placed it beside her coffee mug. So, she said quietly, you finally remembered. A history reopens. The meeting took place at her kitchen table. 2 men, 1 woman, clean shoes, careful language. They spoke of archival errors, of incomplete digital transfers, of land records that never fully made it into modern systems. Ruth listened. When they finished, she stood and walked to the hidden cabinet. She returned with the envelope her husband had labeled decades ago. She placed it on the table. Inside were survey maps, correspondence, signed acknowledgments, and one critical document, proof that the property had served as a silent buffer during a Cold War infrastructure project no one liked to talk about. The visitors exchanged looks. "You kept everything," one of them said. Ruth nodded. "I was asked to." The offer. They offered her a compensation, a generous one, enough to move anywhere she wanted, enough to erase every problem Mateo had tried to create. Ruth listened politely. Then she shook her head. "I never wanted him ruined," she said. "I know," Daniel replied, "but actions finish their own stories." The storm that tests everything. The biggest storm in 20 years arrived in December. Rain hammered the desert. Flash floods tore through dry channels that hadn't carried water in decades. Ruth prepared calmly. She sealed doors, secured records, sat through the night with a flashlight and radio. Water rushed past the house, but never crossed the threshold. The adobe walls held. So did she. What survives? After the storm, neighbors checked in. Some brought food, some brought concern. Ruth thanked them all, but she stayed independent. That mattered to her. The final entry. On the first morning of the new year, Ruth opened her stenography machine one last time. She typed slowly. Not notes, not records, a message. "This land does not belong to the loudest voice or the strongest hand. It belongs to the one who stays. If you are reading this, then staying mattered." She printed it. She placed it in the cabinet. She locked it. The last walk. That evening, Ruth walked to the edge of her property as the sun dipped low. The desert glowed gold and red. She breathed deeply. She felt no fear, no regret, only completion. What time leaves behind. Time did not move faster after everything settled. If anything, it slowed. Ruth Alvarez noticed it in the way mornings stretched longer, in the way shadows lingered across the adobe walls before retreating. The desert did not rush her anymore. It waited. She was 80 now. Her hands moved a little slower. Her knees reminded her of weather changes before the radio ever did. But her mind remained sharp, alert, tuned to details others dismissed. She still walked the perimeter of the property every other day. She still checked the gate. She still wrote notes, not because danger was near, but because attention had become a form of respect. The land had kept her safe. She owed it awareness. The young woman at the gate. The knock came one afternoon in early spring. Ruth was sorting through old photographs when she heard it, light, hesitant. She did not open the door right away. She looked through the side window first. A young woman stood at the gate, mid-20s maybe. Brown hair pulled into a tight braid, backpack slung over one shoulder, no car in sight. Ruth opened the gate, but not the door. "Yes?" The woman swallowed. "My name is Elena Morales. I'm Mateo's daughter." The words landed softly, but they carried weight. Ruth studied her face. The familiar eyes were there, but calmer, careful. "I didn't know he had a child," Ruth said. "He didn't talk about me," Elena replied. "We weren't close." Ruth nodded slowly. "What do you want?" Elena took a breath. "I just wanted to see the house. He talked about it all the time, like it was important." Ruth considered this. Then she opened the gate. Inside, Elena walked through the house quietly. She touched nothing without permission. She listened more than she spoke. "This place feels heavy," Elena said finally. Ruth smiled faintly. "It carries memory." They sat at the kitchen table. Elena didn't ask for money, didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't ask for anything at all. "I wanted to understand what he lost," she said. Ruth met her gaze. "He didn't lose it," she said gently. "He tried to take it." Elena nodded. "That sounds like him." They sat in silence. Then Elena stood. "Thank you for letting me see it. That's all I needed." She left before sunset. Ruth never saw her again. The body remembers. Summer returned, hotter than usual. Ruth began to feel it more deeply, in her joints, in her breathing, in the way exhaustion settled sooner than it used to. She adjusted. Shorter walks, longer rests, more water. She did not complain. She had watched enough people waste energy fighting what could simply be managed. One evening, as she typed notes, her fingers paused. She stared at the paper. For the first time, she couldn't remember what she'd meant to write. Just for a moment. Then it came back. But the pause stayed with her. The doctor's words. The doctor was kind, direct, careful. He said, "Nothing immediate, but you should plan." Ruth nodded. She always had. Preparing without fear. She organized everything, not frantically, not emotionally, methodically. She labeled boxes, updated instructions, left no ambiguity. The land trust documents were finalized. The nonprofit accepted responsibility with quiet seriousness. They asked her one question: "Is there anything else you want remembered?" Ruth thought for a long time. "Yes," she said. "That silence is not absence. It's intention." They wrote it down. The last recording. One night, Ruth turned on her old stenography machine. The familiar rhythm filled the room. She spoke slowly, clearly. Not to anyone specific, to whoever came after. She spoke about the house, about her husband, about the desert and what it demanded. She ended with a simple sentence: "Nothing here was accidental." She shut the machine off. The final storm. The storm came late. Not violent, not dramatic. Just rain. Steady, persistent. Ruth sat by the window watching water trace paths through the dirt that had existed long before she arrived. She felt tired, but not afraid. The house creaked softly. It had weathered worse. So had she. Morning light. Ruth woke just before dawn. She made coffee one last time. She sat at the table facing east. The sun rose slowly, painting the desert gold. She closed her eyes and rested. What remains? They found her later that morning, peaceful, seated, still. The house did not change hands quickly. The land was protected. The records were discovered exactly where she said they would be, and no one ever sold mile marker 12. Final line, true ending. The desert does not remember names. It remembers care, and Ruth Alvarez gave it enough to last forever. What the desert keeps. The desert did not announce Ruth Alvarez's death. It did not change color. It did not still the wind. It did not pause the sun. The morning after she was found, mile marker 12 looked exactly the same as it had the day before. The adobe walls held the night's cool. The mesquite tree cast its familiar shadow across the porch. The gravel driveway waited without expectation. Only the house knew. Only the house understood what it had lost. The people who arrived. They came in small numbers, a deputy first, then Daniel, then a representative from the land trust. No sirens, no crowd, no drama. Ruth had arranged it that way. Daniel stood in the kitchen for a long time without speaking. He recognized the stillness immediately, the kind left behind by someone who had finished what they came to do. "She planned this," he said quietly. The trust representative nodded. She always did. The envelope on the table. They found it exactly where Ruth said it would be, centered on the kitchen table, cream-colored paper, her handwriting, precise, calm. Read last. Daniel opened it. Inside was a single page. If you are reading this, then the house has already chosen silence. Do not disturb it unnecessarily. Everything you need is where it belongs. No instructions for grief, no apologies, no explanations. Just trust. The locked cabinet. The cabinet took longer, hidden behind the closet wall, just as Ruth had described years earlier in a sealed affidavit Daniel remembered but had never seen activated. Inside were records spanning half a century, land use agreements, correspondence with federal agencies, maps layered with handwritten notes, and a final folder, for those who come looking. Daniel sighed when he opened it, because he knew they would. The first inquiry. It began with a phone call from Phoenix, then another from Washington, D.C., then a third from a private research firm that asked too many questions too quickly. Everyone had recently rediscovered a strip of land outside Tucson that had never quite fit into modern systems. Everyone wanted clarity. Everyone wanted access. The trust responded politely and firmly. No access, no sale, no development. The land was protected. The house was part of that protection. The story that almost escaped. A journalist tried next. She filed a public records request, dug into Mateo's case, followed it backward until it led her straight to Ruth. She drove out to mile marker 12 one afternoon, notebook in hand, story already half written in her head. She stood at the gate for a long time, then she left. Some places resist explanation. The granddaughter returns. Elena Morales came back in late autumn. This time, she parked on the road and walked the rest of the way. Daniel met her at the gate. "She wanted to make sure I saw it again," Elena said softly. Daniel studied her. "You won't inherit it." "I know," Elena replied. "That's not why I'm here." They walked the perimeter together. Elena listened as Daniel explained what the land now was and what it would never be. She protected something bigger than herself. Yes, and she protected herself by doing it. Elena left a small stone near the porch before she went. She never returned. The man who tried once more. It happened quietly. A shell company purchased adjacent land, filed a challenge, claimed historical ambiguity. Daniel expected it. He opened Ruth's final folder. Inside was a signed statement dated years earlier, naming exactly this maneuver and preemptively invalidating it. She had anticipated it before it existed. The challenge was dismissed in under a week. The shell company dissolved a month later. Seasons pass. Time moved differently now. The house remained closed but maintained. The trust checked in quarterly. Repairs were minimal, intentional. Nothing modernized, nothing erased. The desert moved around it like water around stone. Some years brought rain, some brought dust, all brought quiet. The children who asked questions. A local school teacher reached out once. "Could my students visit, just to learn about stewardship?" The trust considered it, then declined. Some lessons are not taught by standing inside them. Some are taught by knowing when not to touch. The night when the power went out. Years later, during a rare winter storm, power failed across the region. The house sat dark. Wind passed over it without resistance. Inside, nothing moved, but the cabinet remained locked. The documents remained dry. The intention remained intact. Daniel's last visit. Daniel came alone one final time. Older now, slower. He stood on the porch and looked out at the desert as the sun dipped low. The quiet stir. Years passed. The desert's heat and wind shaped everything, except the house at mile marker 12. The adobe walls endured. The mesquite tree twisted higher. Gravel stayed in place. The house's shadow stretched long and unbroken across the sand every evening. Then something changed. Not the house, not the land. Visitors began appearing. First, a surveyor, curious about boundary lines. Then, a geologist, measuring soil layers. Finally, hikers straying off the main trail, peering at the adobe structure from a distance. None knew Ruth Alvarez personally. None knew the house's full story, but all felt its presence, a sense of something carefully preserved. The first note. A small envelope appeared at the gate, plain, unmarked, no return address. The desert wind hadn't carried it. Someone had placed it deliberately. Inside, the house remembers everything. Respect it. No signature, no explanation. The land trust discovered it first and called Daniel Weiss. He examined it, then nodded. She left more than we realized, he said. Her influence lingers. The young historian. In early spring, a young historian arrived. Name, Samuel Price, early 30s. His eyes scanned the landscape with methodical curiosity. His journal was full of sketches and notes. He asked permission to study the house's architecture and the property's unusual land records. Daniel accompanied him. Samuel's fascination bordered on reverence. She wasn't just preserving a house, she preserved a story that didn't belong to her alone, Daniel explained. Samuel nodded. I feel it. Even empty, it speaks. He spent weeks at the property. He cataloged floorboards, measured the adobe walls, traced the shadows at sunrise and sunset. He studied the filing cabinets, though they remained locked, untouched. He felt their weight. Unseen watchers. One night, a light appeared on the horizon, a truck moving slowly along the highway. Nothing unusual for the desert, but Samuel noticed it. He mentioned it to Daniel. Probably travelers, Daniel said. But Samuel shook his head. There's intent, like they're checking the land, the house. They did not see who was in the vehicle. By morning, it had disappeared. Daniel warned Samuel, some things are better left unprobed. The house protects itself. Samuel only smiled. I think it wants to be noticed, but on its own terms. The secret garden. While documenting the yard, Samuel discovered a small patch behind the mesquite tree, overgrown, mostly hidden. He cleared a little and found a line of stones laid out deliberately, marking a path. At the end, a small metal box buried just beneath the soil. Inside, a collection of Ruth's personal letters, addresses, names, small notes about people who had crossed the land unfairly, including Mateo, legal filings, observations, warnings. Samuel understood. Ruth had left not just instructions, but guidance for the next guardian. He photographed the documents, returned them carefully to the box, and reburied it exactly where he found it. A new caretaker. Months later, the land trust debated the property's future. Should we station someone here permanently? One trustee asked. It attracts attention. Daniel shook his head. No, that would defeat the purpose. The house teaches self-restraint, patience, and respect. A caretaker could never replicate that. Samuel interjected, quietly. Maybe it doesn't want one. Maybe it wants awareness only from those who choose to observe without interfering. The trust agreed. The house remained officially empty, but it was watched, carefully, respectfully. Visitors sensing the weight. Local hikers reported strange feelings near the property. Some claimed to hear whispering when the wind passed just right. Others felt an urge to leave their phones in their pockets and simply observe. Samuel recorded these reports. He did not dismiss them. He believed the land and the house were alive, not in a supernatural sense, but in the sense that Ruth endowed them with careful attention, legacy, and consequence. Even from beyond the grave, Ruth Alvarez had shaped the behavior of those who approached. The first attempted intrusion. 10 years after Ruth's passing, someone tried to open the gate at night. Daniel's team discovered footprints the next morning, small, hurried, not belonging to a known visitor. Nothing had been taken. The house remained untouched. The desert had already warned the intruder. It was not for theft. The land and the house were instruments of preservation. Ruth's legacy endured. The legend grows. Word of the desert house at mile marker 12 spread quietly among historians, students, and the occasional adventurer. They came not for profit, not for curiosity alone, but because the desert and the house emanated a weight that demanded respect. Samuel documented it all. He published articles. Desert preservation, the unique legal protections Ruth had established, and the unusual history of land that existed in defiance of time, ownership, and greed. He did not reveal the exact location in public. Only a few trusted students visited under careful supervision. The house remained, the land remained, and the stories continued. The final evening. One evening, Samuel stayed at a safe distance, watching the desert glow gold and red as the sun set. He reflected on Ruth Alvarez. She had lived quietly, she had fought quietly, and even after death, she had taught quietly. The desert wind blew, it whispered through the mesquite tree, it brushed over the adobe walls. Samuel felt it clearly. The house remembered, Ruth remembered, and the desert remembered too. Final line, extended legacy. The desert does not forget those who care. It does not forgive those who exploit. And the desert house at mile marker 12, under Ruth Alvarez's hand, would remember forever. The winter arrival. Winter had arrived quietly in the desert. Frost coated the edges of the adobe walls in the early mornings, and the air carried a crisp scent of sagebrush. The house at mile marker 12 stood motionless, unchanged. The desert wind whispered, stirring sand along the edges of the property, but inside the adobe walls all remained exactly as Ruth had left it. Samuel Price, now in his mid-30s, returned for another visit. His journals and sketches were becoming a detailed chronicle of the house, the land, and its history. He approached cautiously, knowing that the house demanded respect and observation, not interference. The new discovery. While walking along the northern boundary, Samuel noticed something he hadn't before, a faint trail of stones, half buried in sand, leading toward a small depression in the ground. Curious, he followed it. At the end of the trail, he discovered a small, weathered wooden chest. The lock was intact, but surprisingly, there was no key. The wood smelled of old cedar and dust. He brushed it off, heart beating faster than usual. Inside, he found a stack of papers and a few objects. A small compass, worn but functional, a leather-bound journal belonging to Ruth herself, letters addressed to people who had crossed or threatened the land over the decades. The journal was careful, precise, and meticulous, full of observations, strategies, and personal reflections. Samuel realized this was Ruth's final set of instructions, left intentionally for whoever would come next. The compass. He picked up the compass. There was a small note tucked inside. This points not north, but toward what matters most. Trust it wisely. Samuel examined it closely. The needle didn't move erratically. It always seemed to tilt slightly toward the house itself, as though drawing attention back to the land. He understood immediately. Ruth had left not just physical guidance, but a way to understand the land through intent. A stranger appeared. Weeks later, a stranger arrived at the edge of the property. He introduced himself as Adrian Cole, an anthropologist researching forgotten desert settlements. Daniel Weiss met him first, explaining the history of Ruth Alvarez and the protected property. Adrian was polite, but there was curiosity in his eyes that bordered on obsession. "Can I at least walk around?" Adrian asked. Daniel shook his head. "The house is not open for exploration. Ruth left it as it is. The land is preserved for study only with extreme care and only by those she trusted." Adrian's shoulders slumped, but Samuel saw him watching from a distance, noting every shadow, every movement of the sun across the walls. Signs of life. Despite the property being officially empty, there were signs of subtle life. Small footprints in the sand from desert animals, wind-blown debris carefully diverted by natural rock formations, evidence of minor repairs done by unknown hands, as though someone respected the place without needing credit. Samuel began to understand that Ruth had done more than preserve a house. She had created a space that commanded reverence, even for strangers. The unseen watcher. One evening, while sketching the house at sunset, Samuel felt a presence, not human, not animal, just watching. His hairs on the back of his neck rose. He turned slowly. Nothing. The desert stretched endlessly, quiet except for the rustle of sand against adobe. Then he noticed something unusual, a pattern in the sand along the edge of the property, as if someone or something had walked deliberately, leaving a trail that circled the house before fading into the desert. He traced it carefully. Nothing led off the property. Samuel shivered. Ruth's influence lingered in ways he didn't yet fully understand. The first documented mystery. Samuel opened Ruth's journal again. He noticed a small section marked, "There will come those who arrive not to respect, but to take. They must find nothing. Let them leave wondering if they were ever here at all." He realized that some of the strange events, the footprints, the minor repairs, the watchful feeling, were intentional. Ruth had left the house alive with subtle instructions, a silent guardian enforcing her rules. The letters left behind. Samuel carefully examined the letters. Each one was addressed to a different person who had attempted to interfere with the land over the years. The letters were not angry, they were reminders couched in civility, describing exactly what consequences awaited anyone who attempted to exploit the land. It became clear Ruth Alvarez anticipated threats long after her death, leaving a system to ensure the property remained untouched. The first visitor to truly understand. Elena Morales, Mateo's daughter, returned again. "I felt like I should see it one more time," she said quietly. This time she was accompanied by Samuel. She walked slowly through the yard, looking at the desert horizon, touching nothing, saying nothing. She understood instinctively what Ruth had preserved, the balance of presence and absence, the subtle instructions woven into every stone and board. The legacy solidified. By the end of winter, Samuel and Daniel formally documented everything: the house, the land, the journal, the letters, the compass, and the unusual instructions embedded in the property. The land trust agreed to include these as permanent annotations to the property record, ensuring that Ruth's intent would survive indefinitely. It became a case study for historians, legal scholars, and anthropologists, how one person could protect a place not just with law, but with careful legacy and foresight. Final reflection. Samuel stayed after sunset, alone. The desert stretched gold and red, wind stirring the sand in soft spirals. He whispered to himself. Ruth Alvarez knew how to fight quietly and win forever. The desert held her memory like a living thing. Every grain of sand, every shadow, every trace of wind through the mesquite tree was a testament to her care. The house remained, the land remained, and anyone who arrived felt its quiet authority, whether they understood it or not. Final line, Part 8. Some legacies are loud. Some are subtle. Ruth Alvarez chose the desert. The desert remembered her. And mile marker 12 would never forget.